Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. My name is Simon, I talk about music, and today I've got 7 albums to talk about in short form reviews, just giving some quick, brief thoughts and opinions on these albums. I have had a lot going on in real life, and I haven't maybe had as much motivation as I would like to properly do, more in-depth reviews of these albums, but again, that's why I do mini reviews in the first place. So, anyway, without further ado, let me get right into the reviews. As always, it's just my personal opinion on these albums. And yeah, let's start this off with... I don't really know anything about this band, but I saw this new album getting quite a bit of acclaim, and even though I saw it described as screamo, which is not typically a genre I'm all that crazy about, well, a few other things I saw about this album made me a bit curious, like some of the other genre descriptions I saw, and I figured it probably would not just be endless screaming non-stop. And again, it's getting quite a bit of acclaim. So while I have skipped over their debut from 2022, I decided to check out this new album, and it's not bad, but it's just not really for me. And honestly, it isn't even the style of music that I'm not a huge fan of. It's kind of more post-hardcore than anything, and that's a style of music that I often like quite a bit. But not only does the production not feel as hard-hitting as I'd like, especially with some of the snares sounding so underpowered, but the vocals are not really doing much for me, and lyrically it just feels like a typical post-hardcore album, although maybe I just didn't analyze them enough. Either way, on a musical level, there's just not a lot of strong hooks here, and the whole thing sounds a little underpowered. So yeah, 6 out of 10, not a bad album, but also not really one that gives me a lot to say. I guess there's some cool bounciness to the instrumentation in a song like Your Skin is Gold and a few other moments here, but I'm just not all that wowed, and again, it feels like I'm digging for things to recommend here. I honestly would have probably rated it lower if it weren't a style of music that I quite enjoy in general, so yeah, that's not a good sign for this album. Although the closing track was a cool surprise that completely shifted away from the sound of the rest of the album. So overall, not the worst thing ever, but I cannot really recommend it. I still remember being completely blown away by Feeble Little Horse's 2023 album Girl with Fish at the time of its release. And while revisiting it now, I don't think it holds up quite as well for me as I wish it did. It is still some pretty damn solid indie rock that was reason to be excited about this new album. And honestly, this feels both poppier and more experimental than that album did. I'd probably say this album falls under the category of experimental pop rock, and I don't think it always works, as it can lead to some awkward moments like the pitch shifting on Rewind, or the occasional moment where it feels like this can't figure out what it wants to be. But can you really blame the band for trying such a cool sound? And I think a lot of the writing is solid too, with the kookiness turned up to 11, and they find a way to make a lot of the phrasing fit melodically. And the album's really short too, while still feeling like they pack a lot into its running time. I guess it could have maybe used a bit more polish to make some of the weaker moments still a bit more fitting, as the pacing of the album can be thrown off a little by some of the awkward moments, even if the awkwardness might be somewhat intentional. But still, strong 7 out of 10, and I would highly recommend this to fans of indie rock. It might actually have a decent amount of replay value for me, and while I probably don't like it quite as much as Girl with Fish, it's still really damn solid and doesn't take up too much of your time, so I'd highly recommend it. Here's the second studio album from Friko, an American indie rock band who's been active since 2019, and their debut came out 2 years ago, which I liked but didn't love, and honestly the only song from it that I've really gone back to much is Crashing Through. But revisiting the whole album recently, I can say it's still pretty good, just not fully my thing. And unfortunately, I'm not really wowed here either. And a lot of the moments that feel like they should work are held back by problems that I really cannot look past. For example, Choo has some good instrumental energy and a chorus that should be really strong, but it feels a little too silly and awkward in a way that doesn't really work, and honestly the song just ends up reminding me way too much of Arcade Fire, a band that I have complicated feelings on, but suffice to say that's not a compliment. And I like the lyrical commentary on this album's opening track, Guess, on wanting answers and not being able to know as much as you'd like, including wanting to understand other people's intentions. But the song is a mess sonically, with some really messy production and some vocals that I honestly find kinda grating. And on the flip side, I could also mention some framing issues I have with the inconsistency, or at least confusing narrative of characters on Alice, although that's admittedly a personal issue that I have with the writing, and I can see how some might be able to see past it. But honestly, as an album, this is very underwhelming, where I like it considerably less than their debut, and I don't think there's a song here as good as Crashing Through. Yeah, sometimes there's a really strong moment here and there, but it's literally just very brief moments and not actually full songs, and therefore it just doesn't have the magic that it should, even if I can acknowledge a lot of what this album does well, like some of the melodic moments full of energy on Choo or some cool vocal notes in 7 Degrees. And it's worth mentioning that a lot of these songs run too long in my opinion. So yeah, I don't think this is bad, and I'll give it a 6 out of 10. But I've been seeing a shocking amount of hype for this, and I unfortunately just don't think it's living up to it. If I've got any say myself, then I'd recommend you skip over this one. But you do you, I guess. I was a big fan of NAHreally's 2025 album Secret Pancake, although I really didn't know what to expect from a follow-up album, especially considering that this one's even shorter, running for only 20 minutes. And honestly, I was kinda shocked on my first listen by how little I was liking this. In fact, by about halfway through the album, I was thinking it lacked pretty much all the charm for me that Secret Pancake had, and I was honestly feeling kind of miserable listening to this. Then as the album goes on, it does get a little bit better, or at least I thought it did at first, and then the more I listened to it, the more I realized maybe that's not really the case. Or at first I thought once you're past the first 3 tracks, maybe it's a bit better, but I don't know. Here's the thing. The first song that is really sort of worth hearing is Fuck With Me Too, even though the chorus is kind of obnoxious sometimes. And yeah, from that point on, there's not really a lot going for this album for me. And yeah, it ended up being a really huge disappointment for me, and it's hard to fully explain why. Because NAHreally still has the same delivery that I really liked last year, and yet I just don't find the writing as striking, and thus I guess it just ends up sounding way cornier than it probably should. Or no, that's not the way to say it, because I loved how corny Secret Pancake was, and yet here it's just lacking the charm, and it's hard to fully explain. It also does not help that the instrumentals are not as strong, and there's just not as many standout bars, and as a result, this ends up feeling really underwhelming. Oh, and the inclusion of that weird You've Got a Friend type beat song was definitely a choice. Honestly, I'm feeling a 5 out of 10, and I'm not going to give this a higher score just because of bias, considering I had much higher expectations for this. So yeah, it's really goddamn disappointing. I thought I was going to like this way more. I don't think it's very good. At least I didn't like it. So here's an interesting find that I was not expecting. Aldous is a singer-songwriter from New Zealand who's been active for over a decade now. And while she's quite popular in New Zealand, her popularity has not really crossed over to North America, which might explain why I've never heard of her until now. Honestly, I don't even remember how I heard of this album. And right from the opening track, I Ate the Most, I was intrigued. Not only does this song have an instrumental reminiscent of Radiohead's Everything in Its Right Place, and a suspicious Lemon reference, but the opening lines of this song are instantly intriguing. I'm not afraid like you're not gay, and you're old like I'm on the spectrum. And the haunting cryptic lyrics continue throughout a lot of the album, along with the mysterious sounding instrumentation that really enhances the vibe. And I'd be lying if I said I was fully won over, but I definitely think this album shows a lot of potential and makes me curious to hear more from Aldous, if I get the time. Or at least I'll hopefully remember to check out her next album, whenever that is. Because this is pretty good, and I really like how experimental a lot of this is without taking the emphasis away off of her really great, beautiful vocals. I think the first 2 tracks are really strong, and from there on it can get a little bit underwhelming at points, with not all of the melodies really working for me, and the messy production can get in the way of the album sometimes. But I also want to point out If Lady Does It as another highlight for how well it combines so many contrasting vibes and makes for a really great abstract art piece in musical form. And honestly, that can be said about a lot of this album. So as a whole, I think this is a really strong album that is totally far from perfect in my opinion, and I can understand how this totally might not be for everyone. I would not recommend setting your expectations too high going into it, because for some people it absolutely will not click at all. But it's wild, experimental, and often interestingly melodic, all packaged together in ways that are hard to fully explain or put into words. And it's damn close to great. Very strong 7 out of 10. Again, it's not going to be for everyone, and even I'm not fully won over entirely, but it's at the very least fascinating, and you're likely going to want to hear it if any of this sounds intriguing. I finally decided to listen to the first 3 American football albums in preparation for this review. And honestly, I can't really say I loved any of them. Their first was by far their best if you ask me, and while their third album was better than the second, that 2016 comeback album was drab as hell, I still don't think they've topped their debut album, even with this new one. although this album did grow on me the more I listened to it. At first I just thought it was kind of bland and just wasn't really doing much for me at all, but as I listen to it more, I at least get the appeal a bit. It's got a very moody sound that feels very emotional, which fits with the malaise all throughout the lyrics, which seems to get more intense, or I guess more dull, as the album goes on. Whether it actually does evolve that way or not, I'm not actually sure. Maybe it's just by way of the repetitive themes. But either way, I think it works on this album. And I like a lot of the details, like the backing vocals on Patron, Saint of Pale, and the moodiness of the sound on the opening track, and the watery guitar timbre on Wake Her Up, and the way that some of the keyboards sound intentionally awkward against the other chords being used, and it makes the album more eerie, and it's a cool creative idea. And overall, I think the album's pretty solid as a whole. But I don't think there'll be a lot of individual songs I'll go back to much on here, and I just can't say that I'm that much of an American football fan. In fact, even when you put it all together, I don't think I can go higher than a 7 out of 10. Honestly, it's a fairly heartbreaking album that also managed to be impressive sonically, and it might not really stand out much in the grander scheme of things when I've heard many similar albums that are probably better than this. And yeah, I guess I might call this kind of thing space rock, and it's not really a style that I'm all that crazy about anyway, so maybe take this as a sign to check this out if you like this sound. Well, I guess in that case you've probably already heard it. But you get my general point. I discovered this album from watching Spectrum Pulse's channel where he discussed this very obscure album and talked very positively about it. So I decided to give it a chance, especially considering as a Canadian music critic, I probably don't talk about as many Indigenous artists as I should. So here's a singer-songwriter based in British Columbia, the province that I live in, and it's a pretty mellow folk album. And honestly, I'd recommend Spectrum Pulse's review over my own review. He had a much more thoughtful, in-depth approach. But anyway, as much as I appreciate the writing, which often seems to be about feeling caught between worlds, musically it's just not really my thing. And it's not that I can never like mellow folk music. In fact, I often like it a lot. It's just that there's not really a lot of strong melodies here, and I'm not always a huge fan of Celina as a singer. Although there are moments where she really shines vocally, like on Lungs and Limbs, which is also one of the more interesting tracks here musically. Now, going back to the lyrics, look, I could be completely misunderstanding it, so my apologies if I am, but there definitely seems to be Indigenous themes on here. I saw this described on Bandcamp as Indigenous music, which I personally interpret to mean more than just the artist is Indigenous. And like I said, I feel like there's themes of being caught between worlds, or maybe not even caught between them, but embracing multiple different worlds. And there's some nice poetry here and some interesting commentary on the ways that people are socialized to fit in with whatever part of society is normal. But my honest reaction to this is that outside of the lyrics, there's just not much about this that I find all that appealing. So I'll give it a 7 out of 10, and I would recommend it because, again, the writing is really strong, but I just can't say I love it, and I kind of thought I would. Alright, thank you for watching. Again, it's just my personal opinion on these albums. Feel free to let me know in the comment section if you disagree. But yeah, it's just what I think of these albums, and yeah, I'm curious to hear what you think, and feel free to let me know what you thought of my video as well. I'm always open to suggestions on things I could potentially do to improve. So yeah, I think with all that being said, thank you for watching. I will be back again soon with more album reviews.